It wasn't supposed to be a formal dinner. That's what David had said when he invited me. Just some friends from work, Mom. Casual. So I wore my good shoes, the tan ones with the modest heel, and pressed the navy blouse with the pearl buttons. I even pulled my silver-streaked hair into a neater bun than usual, and dusted a little powder over my ruddy cheeks, just to soften the redness. I didn't think I'd need to try so hard, not for my own son. The restaurant, though, was anything but casual high ceilings, chandeliers shaped like blown glass birds, velvet booths. Everyone spoke in hushes and forks clinked like they were afraid of being heard. I felt my palms start to sweat as soon as I walked in. A hostess in a black suit gave me a look that wasn't unkind, just uncertain. Her eyes lingered on my apron forgotten, over my clothes from earlier that day, still dusted with flour, and then on my shoes, before she offered to take my coat. I didn't have one. I had come straight from my neighbor's kitchen, where I'd been helping prepare scones for her church event. I had meant to go home and change completely, but David had asked me to come early to meet the group. So I arrived early. Silly me. David spotted me before I could ask the hostess for his table. He was sitting near the back of the dining room, in one of those half-moon booths meant to curve people inward, away from the world. He waved, a subtle, almost embarrassed gesture. I waved back, and as I crossed the dining room, I caught just enough of his whisper to freeze me mid-step. "She looks poor, doesn't she?" I'm embarrassed. The words floated past the silverware like steam. I knew that voice. The pitch he used when he was trying to impress someone. I had heard it at his high school debate finals, at his wedding toast, even over the phone when he thought I couldn't tell he was lying about money. I'd never heard it about me. He was leaning toward a group of 3 men in tailored blazers. One of them chuckled, then sat back with his wine glass. David's eyes shifted to me as I approached, and I saw him swallow something, shame or pride. I couldn't tell. "Mom," he said, rising just slightly. "This is Daniel, Micah, and Tyler. We were just talking about marketing strategy. Big pitch next week." I nodded at each man and gave them a smile I had learned over years of PTA meetings and bake sale fundraisers. The kind that says, "I know. You don't expect much, but I'm watching everything." They nodded back, each with varying degrees of politeness and curiosity. I sat at the edge of the booth. No one shifted to make room. No one offered a cushion. David turned slightly to speak to the others, already lost in their world of buzzwords and insider jokes. The waiter came, and no one looked my way. They ordered charcuterie and tuna tartare, a $78 ribeye, a round of cocktails with names that sounded like perfumes. I quietly requested an herbal tea and the house salad. "I'm trying to keep it light," I said with a smile. No one responded. The conversation swirled around analytics, quarterly goals, and venture capital. Occasionally, someone would say something funny enough to make the group laugh, and I would laugh, too, just a breath too late. I didn't belong, and David didn't seem to want me to. When the plates came, no one looked twice as the waiter placed my salad in front of me without ceremony. It was the kind of place where water was poured like wine, and waiters seemed to float. And yet, somehow, I felt like I was clanking through the room in boots made of rust. But I didn't leave. I sat through the meal, chewing slowly, listening carefully. I watched my son's hands, his father's hands, really as they gestured, confidently, assured. I thought about how I had held those hands when they were sticky with lollipops, how I had wiped tears from that same face after scraped knees, how I had cooked every meal of his childhood with these same flour-dusted fingers. Now he didn't even glance my way. Then came the check. The waiter placed it in the middle of the table with a small flourish. A leather folder with a receipt longer than my grocery list. David reached for it lazily, smiling as he patted his jacket. Pocket, but I spoke first. I'll take it. The words came before I fully decided to say them. My voice was steady. The table quieted. David blinked. Mum, no, really. But I was already pulling my wallet from my bag. I didn't reach for the battered fabric one I carried to the grocery store. I reached for the sleek black card tucked in the zipped compartment, my Amex Platinum. The one David didn't know existed. The one I used only for investments, emergencies, and travel I never told him about. The waiter's eyes widened slightly. He knew what it was. His hands were steady as he took it. Are you sure? David asked, eyes darting toward his friends, then back to me. I nodded. It's only money. The silence at the table wasn't heavy. It was electric. Tyler coughed into his napkin. Micah suddenly became fascinated with his phone. Daniel offered. A faint. Thank you, ma'am. David said nothing. When the waiter returned with the receipt, I signed it without blinking. I left a generous tip, not out of pettiness, but because the waiter had done his job well, and I still remembered what it was like to serve people who pretended not to see you. I stood, smoothing my apron, not realizing until then that I'd never taken it off. The powdery imprint of flour still clung to the fabric. It didn't matter. Good night, I said, meeting each of their eyes in turn. David didn't rise. Not until I walked away. By morning, he'd realized what he'd really seen that night. Not a poor woman, but a woman who stopped apologizing for her strength. There was a time David would have sat on my hip like a barnacle, his small hand reaching for my cheek just to make sure I hadn't left the room. I used to find his sticky fingerprints on my mirror and laugh instead of wipe them away. Now I couldn't recall the last time he hugged me without checking his watch. That night, after leaving the restaurant, I didn't go straight home. I drove through the old part of town, past the library I once cleaned after hours, past the diner that paid in tips and leftover pie, past the community center where I learned to sew hems even and fast. My hands still remembered the stitch counts, the feel of stiff polyester uniforms and ripped school pants. David never knew those places. He only saw the results. The packed lunch waiting on the counter, the signed field trip forms, the school shoes always delivered right on time. He used to ask, "How come you're always tired, Mama?" I would tousle his hair and say, "Because I dream in double shifts." The truth is, I worked because I didn't want him to feel the cold I'd grown up with. My mother had counted nickels for gas money. My father vanished before I could form a memory of his face. But I had made a promise to myself at 17, hands raw from scrubbing, knees aching from crouching too long. My child will never feel invisible. And for years, I kept that promise. When David was 5 and his teacher said he had the vocabulary of a 10-year-old, I smiled for days. When he made honor roll, I framed the paper even though the corners curled in the humidity. When he got accepted into a private high school, I didn't blink at the tuition. I cleaned offices until 2 a.m. and learned how to tape my fingers to keep the blisters from breaking. Gerald, God rest him, had worked hard, but after he died on that construction site, crushed by a platform that gave way in the wind, I knew what survival required. His life insurance paid out $50,000. I didn't spend a dime on myself, not even when the roof leaked, or when my teeth cracked from grinding. That money went straight into David's college account. I told him once, "This is your future. Don't waste it." He looked at me with those boyish eyes and said, "I'll make you proud, Mama." I thought he meant it. Years later, when he married Rebecca, I smiled through the unease. She was polished, soft-spoken, wore designer coats with the tags still hidden in the lining. Her family came from money, the kind that gets inherited without effort. I remember meeting her mother at the bridal shower. She glanced at my shoes and said, "Your daughter must be thrilled to marry into our family." I corrected her gently. "I'm his mother." Her face didn't change, just blinked once and smiled tighter. Still, I gave them half my savings for the wedding. Rebecca's father had refused to pay for anything that wasn't a vineyard ceremony. And David said, "She wants something small, Mom. Just elegant." The word small turned out to mean 120 guests, gold-trimmed place cards, and 3 different cheese pairings. I hemmed Rebecca's veil by hand, though she never thanked me. I assumed she was nervous. Then came the house. Our credits. "Thin," David said. "We just need a cosigner." Temporary. Temporary turned into permanent. My name went on the mortgage, and they moved into a 3-bedroom colonial with granite countertops and a kitchen island the size of my old dining table. They said I could visit any time. "You'll always have a place in our home," Rebecca had said at the housewarming party, holding a glass of wine that cost more than I made in a shift. "You're the reason we're here." I didn't know then how fast a place of honor becomes a corner of inconvenience. After David's promotion, the tone shifted. Dinners became tight. Phone calls grew shorter. If I offered help, I was too generous. If I asked for company, I was overstepping. I noticed little things. The invitation to the office. Gala never came again. When I offered to bake cookies for Rebecca's charity event, she smiled and said, "We ordered from a boutique bakery. But thank you." At Christmas, I brought a handmade quilt, months of late-night work, each square stitch from old family clothes. Rebecca opened it and said, "How?" Thoughtful, then folded it and placed it behind the tree. It never made it to the couch. When David's friends saw me tonight, I realized they didn't know my name. Just David's mom. The one who dressed a little plain. The one who didn't fit the decor. They didn't know the story of the woman who kept her family afloat with burnt knuckles and paper-wrapped coins. They only knew the woman in the apron who smiled too politely at a wine list she didn't recognize. I went home after midnight. The kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon from the batch I baked earlier. My shoes made soft thuds against the linoleum. I took off my apron and shook it over the sink, the flour lifting in a white puff that caught the moonlight. My fingers brushed the cloth, slow and steady. I wasn't ashamed. Not of the apron. Not of the flour. I'd just forgotten how heavy a son's silence could be. In the drawer under the phone, I kept Gerald's old notebook, the leather one with fraying corners. Inside were the investment account details I'd managed on my own since his death. Dividends, bonds, even the CD he opened when David was 5. I flipped through the pages and smiled. They had no idea what I carried in my name, or how carefully I'd built it. Quietly. Precisely. For years, they only saw the woman who drove a 10-year-old Honda and wore aprons with cookie dough crusted at the edge. Let them keep seeing that for now. The next morning came cold and quiet. The kind of chill that sits under your skin even after the heater clicks on. I sat at the kitchen table in my robe, nursing a cup of tea that had long gone lukewarm. The newspaper lay open, unread. My eyes kept drifting to the closed drawer where Gerald's notebook rested. The numbers inside had grown slowly, over the years, quiet digits compounding month by month like moss spreading across stone. I wasn't angry. Not yet. Anger is hot, sharp, immediate. This was something else. A thinning in the air. A hollowing out. Disappointment that pulsed behind my ribs like a second heartbeat. By 9 o'clock, the phone rang. I let it buzz once. Twice. I knew the sound of my son's number before I checked the screen. I answered. "Hi, Mom." He sounded too casual, like nothing had happened. Like he hadn't whispered about me across a table filled with laughter that excluded me. "Morning, David." I said. A pause. Then, about last night. Sorry if it got weird. The guys can be kind of blunt. I didn't respond. He cleared his throat. I actually had something I wanted to run by you, he continued, too quickly. We're thinking of renovating the house. Rebecca's been looking into it for months, and we finally got a contractor quote. I closed my eyes. He kept going. It's going to be tight, though. Our equity's still a little thin after the wedding and the car. You know how it is. I remember, I said. How's the business doing? A long pause. It's good. Steady. Just needs some reinvestment, you know? Growth phase. He'd used that phrase before growth phase when he borrowed $5,000 to open his first office and then quietly shut it down a year later without a word. So what is it you're asking, David? Another pause. Then the sound of a phone being handed off. Rebecca's voice filtered in, bright and brittle. Hi, Margaret. Hope you're well. Listen, we had an idea we wanted to get your thoughts on. I straightened in my chair. You've been in that house alone for so long, she continued. Have you ever thought about simplifying? You know, moving somewhere smaller, quieter? There are some wonderful senior communities opening up in Maplewood. I didn't answer. David and I just think you'd be so much more comfortable. Number. Stairs, no yard to manage. More people your age to connect with. We'd even help you find a really nice one. My grip tightened on the ceramic mug. David came back on the line. Mum, you could use the sale to relax a little. Travel. Or invest. You've worked hard all your life. You deserve rest. They spoke as if it was kindness. As if eviction could be softened with a brochure and a pleasant tone. I see, I said. You want me to move out so you can refinance my home. There was no sound on the other end. Just breath. It's not like that, David said finally. We just want to do what's best for everyone. Everyone, I thought. But not me. Let me think about it, I said. And I hung up. I sat in the silence, letting it stretch until the kettle whistled again, though I hadn't turned the burner on. It was just the sound in my head sharp and rising. By noon. I was at Patricia's office. She was younger than me by at least 15 years, but wore her authority like a seasoned surgeon, precise, patient, quietly intimidating. I'd worked with her after Gerald passed, when the paperwork seemed endless and I couldn't stop crying long enough to sign anything legibly. She welcomed me with a warm nod and led me to her office with its floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and clean desk, no photos. Just brass pens and a glass tumbler, and a legal pad with neat rows of writing. What's going on? She asked. I told her everything. The dinner, the whisper, the phone call, the suggestion that I make myself small again. When I finished, she didn't say a word for a full 10 seconds. Then she opened a drawer and pulled out my file. Let's go over your ownership documents again, she said. We'll prepare for what they might try. She read through the mortgage paperwork, nodding. You're a majority holder on their house, she said. He never removed you after the refinance. Probably because he needed your credit history to secure it. And my name's on the deed? Yes, she confirmed. 60%. You also have no obligation to sign any new lending documents or power of attorney unless you initiate it. I nodded. Good. She looked at me then, sharp and calm. What do you want to do, Margaret? I thought about it. About the cold shoulder from Rebecca. The way my photo had disappeared from their hallway. About the 3 jobs I'd worked. The nights I hadn't slept. Folding uniforms. Checking spelling on science projects. Holding a boy's feverish forehead while praying the light stayed on. I want a plan, I said. And I want it airtight. Patricia smiled for the first time. Then let's begin. We spent the next hour preparing. I handed over copies of every account he didn't know about. Patricia drafted a document revoking any standing permissions he may have had through past agreements. We set in motion a protective trust for my remaining assets. Finally, I signed a letter of intent to update my will. When I left her office, I felt something I hadn't in years. Not anger. Not vengeance. Control. Back. At home, I baked flour in the air, butter melting into the dough. The rhythmic roll of the pin, it all calmed me. I didn't need the cookies. I didn't even plan to eat them. I just wanted to remind myself of what I could create with my own hands. In the middle of placing the last tray in the oven, the doorbell rang. It was David. When I opened the door, David stood with his hands in his pockets, shoulders hunched slightly forward like a teenager caught doing something wrong. He hadn't shaved, and there were shadows under his eyes that no lighting could soften. Behind him, his car idled in. The driveway, the engine ticking in the cold. I didn't speak. I stepped aside. He entered like a man unsure of the floor beneath him. His gaze traveled across the room and landed on the baking tray beside the stove. "You're baking?" he asked, as if I'd done something unfathomable. "I needed to keep my hands busy," I replied, wiping flour from my fingers on the side of my apron. "You caught me in the middle of it." He nodded, glancing at the rack of cookies cooling by the window. "Smells like cinnamon. Reminds me of that time I had strep in 3rd grade. I didn't take the bait." Nostalgia wasn't going to smooth over betrayal. David walked to the table and pulled out a chair, but didn't sit. "I wanted to talk in person. About earlier." "Which part?" I asked, gently enough to let him choose his battlefield. Hesitated, then sat down, folding his hands like he was preparing for a job interview. "The call. The thing about you moving. Maybe it came out wrong. Rebecca's been stressed about the renovation, and I thought, you thought I'd roll over like I always have," I said, not harshly, just honest. His eyes flicked up to meet mine, startled by the directness. "I didn't mean it like that, but that's how you said it." He exhaled, deflating. "You're right. I said it wrong." I moved to the stove, took the tray of cookies out of the oven and placed them on the counter. The room filled with heat and scent. I let the silence thicken. "You embarrassed me, David," I said at last. "Not just at dinner, but for months. The way Rebecca talks to me like I'm a burden. The way you let her. The way you whisper about me like I'm a problem to be solved." He shifted in the chair. "That's not fair." "What part isn't?" He didn't answer. I sat across from him and looked at the man I had raised. He still had Gerald's jawline, but not his steadiness. There was a twitch in his fingers, a constant adjusting of his sleeve. Guilt always fidgeted. "I gave you everything I had," I said. "Every shift, every dollar, every dream I pushed aside. I did it gladly. You were my world, David. But I'm not going to be made small now, just because you've outgrown gratitude." He swallowed, jaw working. "We were never trying to make you feel that way. You didn't have to try," I replied. "You succeeded anyway." Another silence stretched between us, filled with heat from the oven, and all the things we hadn't said. He finally asked, "So what happens now?" I stood and walked to the side table by the stairs, opened the drawer, pulled out a folder. Not the red one, he hadn't earned that confrontation yet, but the yellow one with the updated copies Patricia had prepared for me that very morning. I placed it on the table. "These are documents you'll want to look at," I said. "They revoke all previous authorizations you may have had. You're no longer listed as an emergency contact, no longer eligible on any shared accounts. And the house? I've had the ownership reaffirmed. 60% still in my name." His face changed. It wasn't dramatic, just slow like someone realizing they'd walked into a room expecting a party and found a courtroom instead. You went to a lawyer? He said, voice quieter now. I did. The same one who helped me after your father died. You remember Patricia? His brow tightened. You don't need to go that far. We're family. I nodded. And family doesn't treat each other like a stepping stool. He opened the folder, flipped through the pages with growing discomfort. This feels like punishment, he said. No, I answered. This is protection. You've proven you don't see me as a person anymore, just a source of money, of inconvenience. I'm not doing this out of spite. I'm doing this to survive, with dignity intact. He leaned back, hands limp in his lap. Rebecca's not going to take this well. I'm not doing it for Rebecca. He looked down, and for a moment, I saw the little boy who used to curl up next to me during storms, begging for one more story before bed. I didn't think you'd really go through with it, he said. You always let things go. Not anymore, I said. We sat in silence again, only this time it was mine. I had claimed it. After a while he stood up, folder still in hand. He looked at me like he was trying to find something he'd lost. I guess we'll talk soon, he said. Maybe, I replied. Maybe not. He lingered at the door, but I didn't follow him. I stayed in the kitchen, watching the cookies. Cool, steam rising gently like breath in winter. When the door finally closed, I locked it, not in fear, in finality. Then I returned to the table and pulled the red folder from the cabinet. It was time to finish what I'd started. I stayed at the kitchen table long after David left, the room slowly dimming around me until the walls felt softer and more forgiving. The red folder sat under my hand like a pulse I could feel but hadn't yet taken. I didn't rush to open it. Some decisions deserve silence before action. There's something unnerving about realizing how much someone has misunderstood you. I wasn't surprised that David saw me as a liability. I'd felt that shift long before the restaurant. What struck deeper was how easily he'd dismissed the years that made me. The decades of decisions, the quiet calculus of survival. The resourcefulness that had fed him, clothed him, educated him. All of it had dissolved in his eyes into a single phrase. She looks poor. That night, I didn't sleep in my bedroom. I curled up instead on the living room couch, wrapped in the quilt I'd made from Gerald's old shirts. The lamp beside me glowed low and warm. I held a picture frame in my lap, David's graduation photo, still framed with the edges worn soft from dusting. I stared at it long enough for my eyes to burn. Then I set it face down on the coffee table. In the morning, I did what I hadn't done in years. I dressed in quiet clothes, slacks, a warm sweater, no apron, and I drove out to the edge of town. Past the strip malls, beyond the tidy sidewalks, where dog walkers passed with earbuds in. I went to the storage unit I'd kept under my maiden name. The key was buried in the bottom of my sewing kit, hidden beneath packets of needles and old buttons I couldn't bring myself to throw away. Inside the unit, the air was dry and smelled faintly of cardboard and wood polish. I switched on the overhead bulb. Stacked along the walls were boxes labeled with years, some from before Gerald died, others marked with David's name, his handwriting uneven in the early ones and sharply slanted in the later years. I passed those by. In the back, under a blue tarp, was the cedar trunk. I opened it slowly. Inside were the pieces of myself I hadn't needed to look at in a long time. The lease to the first apartment I paid for on my own. The faded note Gerald wrote me the day before his accident. It just said, "You hold us together." And a smaller envelope of receipts from my sewing clients' cash payments folded around thank you notes in careful handwriting. There was also a copy of the second life insurance policy, The one David never knew existed. I'd taken it out privately after Gerald's death and had kept the payments quiet, steady, sacred. It was more than money. It was proof that I'd built something, that I had planned, even as the world tried to reduce me to a role, to a supporting character in someone else's success story. I brought the trunk home, carried it piece by piece into the living room, despite the stiffness in my knees. When everything was laid out on the floor, I spent the afternoon building a different kind of portfolio. Not for court, not for David, for me. I catalogued every document, photographed it, uploaded it to an encrypted drive Patricia had helped me set up last year when I'd started noticing David's probing questions about my finances. Then I wrote letters, one to Patricia, another to the bank manager who'd once told me I was the most meticulous woman in Charleston, and one final letter to David. I didn't write to explain. I wrote so there would be no mistaking the truth when I finally disappeared from his life. No version of "she didn't know what she was doing" would stick. No gentle lies about my decline or confusion would take root. I folded the letter to David in thirds and sealed it in a plain envelope. Then, for the first time in weeks, I walked through the house with purpose. I stood in front of the photos that lined the hallway and removed half of them. I wrapped the frames in newspaper and placed them in a box labeled "Storage, Not Trash." Because even when a heart breaks, it can't always throw everything away. In the kitchen, I cleaned out the cabinet under the sink where I used to keep extra groceries for David and Rebecca's visits. I emptied it. Bleach wipes. Fresh liner. Done. I wiped my hands on my apron and looked around. This house had always felt like it belonged to all of us. Now I wanted it to feel like it belonged to no one. Not yet. Not until I decided what came next. The doorbell rang again. This time, I didn't flinch. It was the mail carrier, dropping off a large envelope addressed in Rebecca's handwriting. Inside were color printouts of home design ideas, light fixtures, kitchen islands, before and after renovation snapshots. No note. Just a sticky tab on one page. "Wouldn't this look amazing in your kitchen?" I stared at the paper, then turned it over and wrote 3 words in thick black ink. "This isn't yours." Then I slid it back into the envelope, resealed it, and dropped it in the outgoing mail pile. Let them interpret it however they wanted. I had clarity now. I knew who I was and who I was no longer willing to be. A quiet morning came like the breath. After a long sentence, no phone calls, no mail, no footsteps behind me. Just me in the house, standing still in our shared quiet. I pulled my sleeves to my elbows and returned to the cedar trunk, laying the rest of its contents across the coffee table. There were bank statements going back 15 years. Pay stubs from the diner, handwritten ledgers with every single tip recorded down to the cent. I hadn't meant to keep so much, but survival had trained me to leave no number unguarded. Next to them, I placed the receipts from David's early adulthood, proof of rent covered, textbooks bought, groceries stopped when internships didn't pay. I found an envelope marked wedding expenses, a breakdown of my contributions, catering deposit, dress fittings, transportation for Rebecca's out-of-town cousins. There was a sticky note attached to the receipt for the florist. In my handwriting, "Don't forget to breathe through this." I hadn't meant that as a note to myself. I'd meant it for her. I wondered if she ever knew. I sat with it all, not to ruminate, but to remind myself I wasn't imagining this. My life had mattered. My efforts had been real, even if memory now tried to twist them into inconvenience. Around noon, I called Patricia. She picked up on the second ring. "I've gathered the full financial trail," I told her. "All of it. Bank documents, receipts, anything that would show how much I've contributed to David's life. Do you want me to begin drafting a notarized affidavit?" I do. She paused, voice softening. You're not obligated to do all this, Margaret. You don't owe anyone proof. I closed my eyes. I'm not doing it to prove anything. To them, I'm doing it to protect myself from revision. Because people forget. Or pretend to. And silence, I've learned, is the most dangerous storyteller of all. We arranged to meet later in the week. She offered to come to me, but I said I'd rather drive. I needed to be the one walking through the door, document box in hand, spine straight. No more polite deference. After we hung up, I turned to the kitchen. The stove needed scrubbing. The inside of the kettle was starting to stain. I cleaned like I used to pray, hands busy, thoughts loosening. I scrubbed the oven rack, wiped the corners of the pantry, reorganized every drawer. Then I found it. Tucked behind a basket of old cookbooks and faded coupons, Rebecca's wedding registry, still folded in the original envelope. I must have saved it without thinking. A catalogue of wants. Gold-edged plates, crystal tumblers, embroidered napkins. None of it practical. None of it designed for a life that included struggle. I'd bought the Dutch oven listed on page 3. It had cost nearly a week's pay. She had thanked me by text. No emoji. No heart. I held the envelope for a moment, then slid it into the shredder. Some artifacts weren't worth archiving. Later that afternoon, I pulled into the credit union where I kept my smaller accounts, just the ones David knew about. I'd scheduled a quiet meeting with Maria, the branch manager, who greeted me like an old friend. I'd like to make some changes, I said. Handing her my ID. We moved the funds. Consolidated accounts. Changed beneficiaries. Closed the joint safety deposit box. When we finished, she looked at me and asked gently, "You doing all right, Margaret?" "I am now." She placed the papers in an envelope and handed it to me. "You're not the first mother I've seen do this. But you're the first who smiled doing it." I didn't know I'd been smiling. I suppose it was the strange comfort of momentum. When I returned home, there was a package on my porch. No return label, but the handwriting was unmistakably David's, messy, too rushed, like he thought speed could mask guilt. Inside was a grey cardigan and a note. "Saw this and thought of you." Rebecca picked the colour dot. It was the same colour as the napkins from their engagement dinner. I folded it neatly and placed it in the donation bag I kept in the hallway. Then I changed the lock on the porch mailbox. That evening, I sat on the back steps with a warm cup of tea and let the day exhale. This wasn't vengeance. This was reclamation. No announcements. No confrontation. Just action. One careful, deliberate correction at a time. I watched the light shift over the backyard. The lawn needed trimming and the hydrangeas were bare this time of year, but there was beauty in its dormancy. It reminded me that survival wasn't always about blooming. It was sometimes about staying rooted while others underestimated your depth. Before heading inside, I checked the mail slot one last time. Empty. Good. I locked the door behind me, double-checking the bolt. Then I slipped off my shoes, untied my apron, and stood still in the quiet hum of the kitchen. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon and lemon polish. I ran my hand over the countertop, remembering the years I had cooked here for David and his friends, never once asking for thanks. That part of the story was over. But the woman who had survived it, she had just begun. 2 days passed before the next sound of David filtered through my life again, not in person, not even a phone call. Just a voicemail left at 3:14 p.m. "Mom, I'm hoping we can reset things. I know things got tense, but maybe we could talk. Just you and me. No pressure. Let me know." He didn't mention the documents, or the folder, or the look on my face when I handed it to him. I imagined him pacing his home office, still trying. to draft a version of this story where he was misunderstood, not manipulative, still hoping I'd fold with enough charm. I didn't respond. That evening, I pulled out Gerald's old ledger book from the cedar chest. It wasn't the kind you kept for taxes or banking. This one was made of thick, yellowed paper, bound in cracked leather and labeled simply, Home. Inside were pages of notes, dates of oil changes, the serial number for the furnace, measurements for the back fence he'd built one summer when David was 10. There were also scribbles in the margins, reminders, written in Gerald's blocky print. Replace roof shingles before winter. Check on Margaret's tires. Save for David's braces. He had documented everything, not just the house, but the way he cared. Quietly, without fanfare, as if preserving our life one line at a time would somehow keep it from slipping away. I flipped through the pages until I reached the one that stopped me cold. April 14th. Margaret paid extra to cover David's tuition shortfall. Do not forget. 4 words underlined. Do not forget. I closed the book slowly, like sealing an old wound. I wasn't seeking vengeance. I wasn't bitter. But I had no intention of forgetting. That same night, I heard a car outside just past 8 p.m. The porch light was off, but headlights washed over the living room wall. I stepped to the front window, peered through the side of the curtain. Rebecca. She didn't get out of the car. She just sat behind the wheel, engine idling. Her profile was rigid, her shoulders squared toward the dashboard. At one point, she looked up toward the house toward me, perhaps, but didn't move. Then she reversed out of the driveway without ever ringing the bell. I stood in the dark for a moment longer, trying to feel something. Anger, sadness, pity. Nothing came. Just a faint, almost clinical curiosity about what she might have rehearsed and then abandoned. The next morning, I went to the bakery on Main Street. Not for bread, I still had half a loaf at home, but for the ritual. I liked the way the place smelled, the way the woman behind the counter always called me Miss Margaret, even though she knew I was decades past Miss. She handed me a bag with 2 cinnamon rolls. These are still warm. Extra icing today. I thanked her and paid in cash, smiling at the way her eyes crinkled with sincerity. Back in the car, I didn't start the engine right away. I just sat, with the bag in my lap, and stared through the windshield, letting the scent fill the air. I thought of all the times I'd brought David here as a boy. He used to press his face to the glass of the pastry case, like it held buried treasure. "Can I have 2?" he'd ask. "One for now and one for later." And I always said yes, because I had grown up being told no. I didn't blame him for not remembering. I blamed him for not asking. When I returned home, the answering machine blinked. One message. David again. "Mum, if you're screening, just hear me out. Rebecca's been stressed. We both have. I think we just misread everything. You've always been there for us, and I know I haven't said it enough. But I really do appreciate everything you've done. We don't want to lose you over. The misunderstanding." I deleted it. Some messages were not bridges. They were anchors. That afternoon, I began drafting something of my own. A letter. Not to David. Not to anyone. Really to myself. I sat at the table, the same one where I used to mend socks and write grocery lists. And I began, "You do not owe softness to those who made you feel like stone. You do not owe presence to those who made your absence more peaceful. You owe truth. To yourself. To your years. To your hands that fed a boy who now cannot stomach the weight of your wrinkles. Let that be enough." The words came slowly at first, then faster. I wrote for an hour without stopping. When I was finished, I folded the letter and slipped it into the back of Gerald's ledger, between oil change notes and garden plans, because that was where my story belonged, not on some shelf of sacrifice, but woven into the lines that built this life. Later, I lit a candle on the counter, the kind Gerald used to tease me for buying in bulk. I stood with my hand over the flame, not close enough to burn, just close enough to feel it, and remembered what it meant to be a woman who never gave herself the permission to stop. Not anymore. It was the light that woke me, not the sun through the window, but the amber glow of the refrigerator bulb, humming steadily against a dark kitchen. I had fallen asleep at the table, head propped on folded arms, the letter still resting inside the ledger. The candle had long since burned out. A smear of wax marked the edge of the counter like a fingerprint. I straightened slowly, joints creaking, and crossed to the fridge to grab a glass of water. My breath fogged the inside of the door as I opened it. I stood for a moment, not for the food, but to ground myself. Milk, lettuce, eggs, the plain constancy of it. No metaphor, just groceries. Proof of ordinary life continuing. I sipped slowly and wandered to the living room where the morning light was beginning to stretch its fingers through the curtains. I turned on the radio low, old jazz barely whispering through the speakers, and started moving. There are different kinds of cleaning. There's the frantic kind, meant to impress guests. The angry kind, where each swipe of the rag is a retaliation. And then there's this kind, the kind you do when your mind is full, and you need your body to carry the weight. I polished picture frames and wrapped up knickknacks in tissue. I made 3 piles. What I'd keep, what I'd donate, and what I'd give to no one. I didn't cry once. I only paused when I came across Gerald's watch. He hadn't worn it in. The last year of his life, he said time didn't scare him anymore, but I'd kept it on the windowsill above the sink. The battery had long since died. I wound it gently now, just enough to hear the hands click back into rhythm. That sound had once comforted me in silence. I placed it back, careful not to smudge the glass. By mid-morning, the living room was bare around the edges. Not empty. Not yet, but pared down. Honest. I had moved the couch slightly and removed the coffee table entirely. I kept the chair by the window. It was mine. I wasn't making space for anyone else anymore. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee and poured it into the blue speckled mug Gerald once said made my hands look like they belonged in someone's grandmother story. I didn't mind the phrase. Back then, it sounded like love. Now, I wasn't anyone's background character. At noon, I walked to the back shed. The key was still hanging on the old nail beside the back door. Inside, the air was heavy with dust, and the scent of paint thinner and rusted hinges. I stood for a long time, staring at the boxes. David had stored some of his childhood things there when he and Rebecca moved in together. Baseball trophies, debate ribbons, a set of worn encyclopedias from his school days. There was also a plastic bin labeled Mom's Craft Stuff. The lid creaked as I opened it. Inside were spools of thread, pinking shears, half-used embroidery hoops, and the pincushion I'd made out of an old shoulder pad. The kind of items nobody missed unless they were gone. I set the bin aside and focused on the larger cardboard box at the bottom. It wasn't labeled. Inside, I found something I'd forgotten existed: photo albums, yes, but also a thick brown envelope labeled in Gerald's handwriting. For later, if she ever doubts. My hands trembled as I slid the flap open. Inside were receipts, letters, and clippings. One receipt from the hardware store had a note scribbled on the back. She covered this when I couldn't. Don't forget. Another was a letter I'd written to him when David was 5, thanking him for showing up to the school play even after a 10-hour shift. I didn't know he'd kept it. At the very bottom of the envelope was a printout, a scanned image of our original deed. My name in black ink, unmistakable. It wasn't necessary. I already had my own copy. But it struck me that Gerald had wanted to leave it in his own way, in a place he thought I'd find when I needed it most. A whisper through paper. You were always the one who held us steady. I carried the envelope inside and laid it on the cleared table, not to study, just to witness. That afternoon I walked to the post office. I mailed 3 letters, one to Patricia, one to the bank, and one addressed to the attorney who had handled the deed back when we bought the house. I included copies of everything. I labeled them documentation for future reference. As I walked back, wind bit at my cheeks, and the sky hung low and grey. I tightened my coat and tucked my scarf under my chin. Each step forward felt like reinforcement. I wasn't retreating into silence. I was rooting myself deeper into the life I had built. Later that night, as the wind howled and the heater clicked on, I stood in front of the mirror over the bathroom sink. I studied the lines around my mouth, the faded scar near my temple from the day I slipped on black ice behind the school cafeteria. I used to hide that mark with foundation. Now I saw it as proof. I had fallen. I had gotten up, again and again, and I would keep doing so until there was no more ground left to rise from. By the weekend, the house had grown quieter than usual, not in sound, but in expectation. The kind of stillness that lingers when you know something is ending, but no one has declared it yet. The scent of cinnamon from earlier baking still clung to the air, but it had faded to something subtler, like memory. I moved through the space differently now, deliberately, without apology. I started with the hallway closet. Every box labeled David came down, one by one. Inside were yearbooks, old baby clothes, and the art projects I'd kept long after he stopped making them. I paused at the papier match volcano, still crusted with dry glue at the seams. The tissue paper lava crumpled and sun-bleached. He had cried when it didn't erupt during the science fair. I stayed up late that night baking cookies anyway. Told him that failure doesn't mean you're not proud. It just means something didn't work that day. Wrapped the volcano in soft packing paper. Placed it into a bin marked storage. No rush. There were things I wasn't yet ready to throw away. But I didn't need to see them every day either. At noon, Patricia called. We received a response, she said. From Rebecca, not David. I stood at the kitchen counter, one hand resting on Gerald's envelope from the day before, my fingers tracing the edge of the seal like a border I was deciding whether to cross. What did it say? She denies any financial impropriety. Claims you've misunderstood the nature of the accounts. I nodded slowly, not because I was surprised, but because I knew it was her way of keeping the record clean. No confessions. Just a smokescreen of politeness. Will that matter? No, Patricia said. We've got documentation. Clear enough for anyone who matters. But this is the part I think you should hear. She also said, we didn't realize how fragile she'd become. This escalation must be stress-related. I didn't respond right away. She's laying the groundwork for a narrative, Patricia added, one that makes you seem forgetful, overwhelmed. I took a long breath, not out of fear, but out of recognition. I'd been preparing for this. I just hadn't expected her to be so quick to dress concern as condescension. I'll be in your office Monday, I said. We'll finish the rest. After we hung up, I went to my desk and pulled out a small notebook I'd been keeping since the first call with David, the one where he asked if I'd ever considered moving out. I'd written down dates, direct quotes, observations. Not to build a case for the world, but to remind myself later what was said and what was not. I flipped through the pages now, underlining Rebecca's phrase in my memory. You'd be more comfortable elsewhere. Not safer. Not loved. Just elsewhere. That night, I called Claire. We hadn't spoken in months. Maybe longer. Not out of falling out, just the kind of mutual drift that comes with age and effort. She picked up on the third ring. Margaret, she said. voice lifting in surprised warmth. "Are you all right?" "I am," I replied. "But I need to ask a favor." I told her everything in plain language. No bitterness. Just facts. When I was finished, she was quiet for a beat. "Well," she said finally, "you always were. The one who knew where the fire extinguisher was before anyone smelled smoke." I smiled. "I'm not trying to burn anything down." "No," she said, "but you're not letting yourself get scorched either." Claire offered to meet for coffee and I accepted. We decided on a small cafe we used to frequent after PTA meetings, the one where we once spent an entire afternoon plotting how to raise enough for the school library's broken heater. Before I left the house, I changed out of my flour-dusted apron and put on a navy coat with deep pockets. In one pocket, I tucked the letter from Gerald. In the other, the updated trust documents. Not for drama, for history. Claire was already seated when I arrived, wearing the same gold hoop earrings she'd worn since we were 35. She stood and hugged me without hesitation. "You look strong," she said, eyes scanning my face. "Maybe tired, but strong." We sat in the window booth, and I ordered chamomile tea. Claire opted for black coffee, as she always did, like motor oil, she used to say, but useful. We didn't dive straight into the story. We let it simmer under small talk, as women do when we know grief is coming up behind the conversation. Eventually, she placed her hand on mine. "What are you going to do with the house?" she asked. "I'm not sure yet," I said, "but I'm not leaving it in their name." Claire nodded like she'd already guessed that answer. "I've been thinking about who else needs a roof," I added. "Who actually needs what I have?" Her eyebrows rose. "You have someone in mind?" "Not yet," I said, "but I'm open to the idea of leaving something behind that doesn't require my bloodline to be worthy of it." Claire leaned back. "That sounds ... radical and deeply." "Right." When we parted, she hugged me longer than before. "Let me know if you need help clearing things out," she said. "I've still got strong hands." "I remember," I said. "You once carried 2 folding tables by yourself." She winked. Never underestimate a tired mother with a deadline. Back home, I placed the coat back in the closet, then returned to the hallway. I looked at the blank spot where David's photo had once hung. I didn't feel a hole. I felt room for what would come next. Not revenge, but redefinition. The house felt different the next morning. Not in smell or light or air, but in the way I moved through it. My steps were no longer accompanied by hesitation. I wasn't peeking around corners anymore, or listening for the phantom tones of someone else's authority in my space. I didn't check my phone for David's voice or glance toward the driveway expecting a car I hadn't invited. I was done, waiting for their next move. I had made mine. At 10 a.m., I pulled into Patricia's office lot with my documents in a thick manila folder, secured by a brass clip I found in Gerald's old desk. I wore my work shoes, not the scuffed ones I used in the garden, but the black leather pair that had once seen job interviews and funerals and 3 separate tax appointments. I wore them because they reminded me of how many versions of myself I'd held in one lifetime. Patricia greeted me with her usual calm efficiency. Her suit was cream today, tailored and crisp. She always looked like she had already solved the problem before you could speak it out loud. "I'm glad you're here," she said, gesturing to the seat across her desk. I placed the folder on the table and sat down, my hands steady now. A week ago, they trembled as I passed documents across the same desk. But now I was done asking. I was documenting. She opened the folder, leafing through copies I'd arranged in careful order. Notarized deed affirming majority ownership of the house, a formal revocation of power of attorney, evidence of bank account, transfers, and a signed statement outlining how and when David had used my information without my consent. I've also included a printed transcript of my journal notes. I said. I highlighted the quotes from the calls and voicemails. Patricia looked up at me with something that hovered between respect and solemnity. You've built a clean wall of facts. I wasn't sure how else to protect myself from being rewritten. You're doing more than protecting, she said. You're reclaiming. We went over everything, line by line, making edits. Only to strengthen clarity. Her assistant came in briefly to witness a signature. Then the last document slid toward me. An updated will. This version removes David and Rebecca as beneficiaries, Patricia explained. It leaves the house, assets, and investment portfolio to a charity or individual of your choosing. You don't have to decide that today. But I already had. There's a women's education foundation in the next county, I said. They fund single mothers going back to school. I looked it up last night. She wrote that down without flinching. I'd also like to include a clause that allows for emergency housing use of the property, in case they ever need a transitional home. Patricia glanced up. That's generous. It's not sentiment, I said. It's clarity. I don't want my story to end with locking someone out just because I was locked out first. She nodded. You're the author now. When the paperwork was done, she placed everything in a fresh envelope and handed it back to me. We'll file the public declarations today. Expect confirmation in about 10 business days. I'll send the scanned copies by this evening. I thanked her and rose to leave. Just before I reached the door, she said, Margaret? I turned. You're not the first woman I've seen take this road, but you may be the first who turned it into a path for others. Outside, the afternoon sun was brighter than expected. I slid on my sunglasses and drove home with the window cracked open, letting the wind tug softly at the ends of my hair. It smelled faintly of earth and early spring. I stopped at the hardware store on the way. I bought new locks. The man behind the counter gave me a questioning look when I asked for reinforced deadbolts and smart key technology. Big security job? He asked. I smiled. Just correcting a few things. At home, I brewed a fresh pot of coffee and laid the new keys on the table sleek, solid, untouched. I traced the edge of the old lock still on the door before removing it. The screws came out easily. Almost too easily. David had helped install it after the second refinance, saying, It's time for a real upgrade. Back then, I didn't question his choices. Now I understood the difference between assistance and intrusion by dusk. The lock was changed, the spare keys labelled, and a small sign placed beside the door. Private residence, access by invitation. Only not dramatic, just clear. That night, I took the photo albums out of the box marked no rush. I didn't flip through them all, just the ones from David's early years. I touched his face in each one. The gap-toothed smile, the paper, crown from his kindergarten birthday, the high school dance photo where he wore his father's tie. I left those photos out. Not on display, but not hidden. I wasn't erasing him. I was simply no longer erasing myself to keep him present. The new lock clicked shut with a satisfying finality. I stood on the inside of the door, one hand still resting on the knob, the other holding the new set of keys. Outside, the porch light flickered on automatically. Gerald had wired it that way years ago, long before we knew how quickly routines could turn into rituals. I slipped the keys into my apron pocket and leaned, my forehead briefly against the door, listening not for footsteps or tires or any ghost of David's presence, but just to the stillness. There's a kind of quiet that arrives only after you've closed a chapter completely, and it had taken me this long to learn how to invite it in without apology. That night, I roasted a chicken for one, Not out of loneliness, but as a reminder that I didn't need a guest to justify care. I set the table with my favorite stoneware plate, the one Rebecca once called quaint in the way people do when they mean old-fashioned. I poured a glass of wine, lit a small votive candle, and took my time carving each bite. I savored the sound of the knife against the porcelain. I ate slowly, without distraction, without television or a book in my lap. When I finished, I washed each dish by hand, watching the water run clear before I set the last plate in the rack. Then I dried my hands on the old embroidered towel that had belonged to my mother, frayed at the edges, but still serviceable, still soft. At 8 o'clock, my phone buzzed. A text from David. Can we talk? I'm coming by. I just need a few minutes. Please. There was no question mark. Just a tone I knew too well. Urgent, but practiced. He always reached out like this right after the point of no return, when the damage had already passed through my threshold and he was simply looking for a soft landing. I typed 2 words. No entry. I didn't elaborate. I didn't have to. 10 minutes later, headlights slashed across the curtains. I didn't move from my chair. The knock came loud, familiar, sharper than necessary. Mom? David's voice carried through the door, low but rising. I just want to talk. I stayed seated, elbows resting on the arms of my chair. My heart beat steadily, not quickly. Mom, come on. I know you're there. I watched the flame of the votive candle flicker on the table beside me. The air held. Its breath. Don't do this. You're making it worse. Worse than what? I thought. Worse than betrayal. Worse than siphoning my trust like it was a reservoir that would never run dry. Worse than calling me fragile to strangers so that they'd believe my memory was the problem. The door shook once more beneath his knuckles. I know we messed up, but we're still family. That word. Still. As if being born from someone's body entitled you to a permanent room in their dignity. I rose slowly and crossed the room until I stood directly behind the door. Not to open it, just to speak where I knew he'd hear. You're not locked out, I said, voice steady. You're just no longer entitled to walk in. He didn't answer. Only silence followed. No footsteps retreating, no tires crunching. Just the growing gap between the life I had built and the one I had let him borrow for too long. Eventually, the headlights receded. I waited a full 5 minutes before unlocking the door, stepping out onto the porch. The night air was sharp, edged, with the scent of pine and something faintly metallic. I pulled my cardigan tighter, letting the cold work its way into my lungs before I exhaled. A small white envelope had been left on the doormat. No name on the front. I picked it up, turned it over. It was sealed with a smudge of something, maybe wine, maybe coffee. Inside was a handwritten note. David's handwriting, slanted and rushed. I don't know how to fix this, but I don't want to lose you completely. I didn't understand how far gone things were until you stopped answering. I thought we were just being practical. I didn't know I made you feel disposable. There was more. Apologies that didn't. Ask for forgiveness. Explanations that didn't erase the truth. A closing line. I still need you, even if you don't need me anymore. I folded the letter, not because it hurt, but because it didn't surprise me. Need was never the same as love. I had built an entire life on the confusion between the two. I went back inside, placed the letter beside Gerald's ledger on the table. I would read it again later. Maybe. Maybe not. But I had decided something. Tomorrow, I would begin the paperwork to transfer partial ownership of the house, not to David, but to the foundation I'd chosen. A legal clause would allow for emergency housing placement, women starting over, women like me, just decades earlier, who hadn't had a ledger or a lawyer or a folder full of signatures. Let the house carry a legacy of safety, not guilt. Let it speak of strength, not silence. I left the letter unopened the next morning. It was enough to know what it said. There are some words that, no matter how carefully shaped, still echo the same damage. David's handwriting always leaned right, rushed at the edges, just like his apologies, just like his affection. I placed the envelope in the kitchen drawer beneath the tea towels, not out of sentiment, but because I didn't want it in plain sight. It didn't need to be honored, only acknowledged. The air had turned colder overnight. I layered a thick shawl over my cardigan, then pulled my apron over both. Old habits. The apron made me feel steady, like my hands had purpose even. When my heart was uncertain, I baked a small apple tart in the morning. Not because anyone was coming, not for an occasion, just because it was something I could do well, and I wanted to fill the kitchen with cinnamon instead of doubt. The crust flaked perfectly. I placed it on the counter to cool, the smell curling into the hallway's dot as I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of weak tea. My thoughts turned not to David but to the house, the wood beneath my feet, the wallpaper I had stenciled in the early 90s, the crack in the ceiling above the doorway that never grew worse but never quite disappeared. This home had held every version of me: grief-stricken wife, weary mother, invisible helper, and now, for the first time, whole woman. At 11:13 a.m. The doorbell rang. I didn't jump. I rose slowly, wiped my hands on the apron and walked to the door. I didn't look through the peephole. I knew the shape of that silence. I opened the door but left the screen closed between us. Rebecca stood on the porch. No makeup. Wind-blown hair. A designer coat too thin for the weather. She gave me a smile I'd never seen from her before. Small, apologetic, without gloss. I didn't know where else to go, she said. That doesn't mean this is where you should be, I replied. She nodded, accepting it without protest. David's upset. I didn't respond. She continued. He's angry. But more than that, he's scared. He doesn't understand how things changed so fast. They didn't, I said. He just didn't notice until I stopped hiding. Rebecca looked down at her shoes, then back at me. I wasn't always kind to you. I know that. That's true. I thought I was being neutral, polite. But I see now that's just another way of being cruel. I didn't soften. I didn't step forward. I let her sit with her own words. After a long moment, she asked, "Can we come inside? Just for a few minutes." I shook my head. "You can say what you need to from there," I said. "But the door stays closed." Rebecca's eyes shone with something I couldn't quite name. Maybe shame. Maybe exhaustion. She reached into her bag and pulled out a thin, folded stack of papers. "I brought a letter," she said. "A formal one. David thought it might help to put things in writing. What he owes. What he acknowledges." I made no move to take it. "Are you trying to apologize or negotiate?" I asked. "Maybe both," she said honestly. "I don't blame you if you never trust us again. I just thought we should at least put the truth on record." I opened the screen. Door just far enough to accept the papers, then shut it again. "You've had access to the truth for years," I said. "What you're offering now is clarity, but only because I forced your hand." "I know," she said. "But thank you for opening the door this far." I didn't say goodbye. She walked back to her car slowly. I waited until I heard the engine turn over and the tires pull away before I locked the door again. I returned to the kitchen table and unfolded the documents. It wasn't quite what I expected. It wasn't legal. It wasn't NOTARIZED. That was handwritten. By David. A list. Every loan I'd given him. Every tuition payment. Wedding expenses. Mortgage contributions. Even the cost of the Dutch oven from their registry. Each line ended with the word owed. And at the bottom, I can't undo what I've done, but I won't pretend it didn't happen. I set the pages down. No tears came. Because truth, when it finally arrives, is never heavy. It just settles. I slid the pages into the red folder. Marked final. Not for revenge. For history. Later that afternoon, I drove to the library and left an anonymous donation in their Dropbox with a note. For the women who carry more than anyone sees. Then I went home, reheated a slice of tart, and sat with a notebook open on my lap. This time, I wasn't writing to anyone else. I was writing for me. It rained the next morning, a soft, slanting drizzle that turned the sky the color of old pewter, and made the garden soil smell like a promise. I stood by the window with both hands around a chipped blue mug, watching droplets race each other down the glass. The street was empty, the porch damp. No cars, no visitors. Just the slow sweep of wind through the branches outside. I liked the quiet more than I used to. Not the silence of being ignored or left behind, but the kind I'd earned. The kind that comes when you stop performing for an audience that never deserved. Front row seats. The list David had written still sat on the counter, untouched since the day before. I didn't need to reread it. I had lived every line. He hadn't offered money or amends, just the admission that he knew what he'd taken, that he'd always known. It wasn't closure. It wasn't justice. But it was a door that would stay closed now, not out of spite, but because I had finally built something too solid to be shaken by an apology scribbled under pressure. Tucked the list into the back of Gerald's ledger, right behind the note he'd left me years ago. You hold us together. Funny how much weight a single sentence could carry. I spent the morning preparing the dining room. Not for guests, not for family. For me. The long oak table had gathered dust over the year's birthday candles, Christmas gravy spills, wine rings, from conversations that had turned sideways. It would hold none of that. I laid out a single plate, a linen napkin, silverware polished from a forgotten drawer. I added a shallow vase with 3 garden daisies and 1 marigold that had somehow survived the late season frost. I didn't think about symbolism. I just thought they looked honest. I took my time with lunch. Roasted vegetables, a small bowl of barley soup, a warm biscuit I'd brushed with butter until it glistened. When I sat down, I didn't reach for my phone. I didn't try to fill the space with noise. I just ate, each bite slow, each moment mine. I thought about all the meals I'd made over the years with no one asking how I'd been that day. No one wondering if I'd eaten before the baking started. No one saying thank you unless I reminded them it mattered. Now, no one could interrupt it, or diminish it, or whisper behind a wine glass, "She looks poor." Let them look. I was rich. In things that couldn't be tallied. After lunch, I wrote a letter to the Women's Education Foundation, finalizing the gift. The house wouldn't transfer until I passed, but I wanted them to have everything in place. I described the home briefly. Modest, full of light, a good oven, a strong roof. A place, I hoped, where women could rest and reimagine. When I finished sealing the envelope, I ran my hand across the return address I printed in ink. Not Margaret Widow. Not Margaret Mother. Just Margaret. That was enough. In the late afternoon, the wind shifted and the rain paused. I stepped out to the porch, barefoot, apron still tied, and let the cold wood planks beneath my feet remind me of the realness of this life. How far I had come without needing anyone's approval to mark the miles. The front walk was clear. Number. Cars. No letters tucked under the mat. No trace of David or Rebecca. Just wet leaves gathering along the curb, and the low hum of a world moving forward without spectacle. I went inside, lit the small lamp in the hallway, and folded the apron I wore. The flour smudges along the edges reminded me of the tart, the biscuits, the hundreds of meals before them. I didn't need to wash it right away. It carried too much of what I'd made for others, and what I was now making for myself. I placed it gently on the back of the kitchen chair and poured myself a final cup of tea. I carried it into the living room, where Gerald's ledger sat on the side table beneath a small framed photo. Just him and me. On our wedding day, his tie askew. My smile wide and hopeful. I smiled back at it now, not because things had gone as planned, but because they had gone on. I sat in my favorite chair, tea warming my hands, and looked around. The walls were lined with quiet. No trophies, no decorations. Just the slow, solid pulse of a home that had bent under pressure but never broken. A home I had protected. A life I had restored, without spectacle, without applause. Tomorrow, I'd drive to the courthouse and file the final papers. But tonight, the table had been set, the chair had been filled. The door had stayed closed, and that was enough.